All right, good afternoon. Just as a reminder, the Secretary General will deliver a major address on climate change, and this will take place at 3 p.m. in the delegates' dining room. You all, of course, are invited, and the address will be webcast. The Secretary General will speak to an audience of young people, business leaders, diplomats on the eve of a global climate action summit in San Francisco, as well as the annual gathering during the General Assembly. The Secretary General, during his remarks, will emphasize the need for greater ambition and stronger political leadership in addressing what he has called the defining threat of our time. And in Bangkok, the climate change conference ended on Sunday with an urgent call for accelerated climate action. The executive secretary of the UN Climate Change of UNFCCC, Patricia Espinosa, said the conference had resulted in uneven progress on the guidelines to implement the Paris Agreement. And she said that this underlines the urgent need for continuing work in the coming weeks. You can find more on the conference on the UNFCCC's website. And this morning, the Secretary General addressed the Security Council on corruption in conflict, noting the prevalence of corruption in all countries, rich and poor, north and south, developed and developing. The Secretary General highlighted estimates by the World Economic Forum that show the cost of corruption to be at least $2.6 trillion US dollars, or 5% of the gross domestic product. The Secretary General noted that corruption could be a trigger for conflict and added that the consequences of corruption in times of conflict can be especially devastating as they affect the most basic needs and exacerbate hunger and poverty. The Secretary General said people across the world would continue to express outrage at corruption of their leaders and how deeply corruption is embedded in societies. He called on leaders everywhere to listen to nurture a culture of integrity and to empower citizens to do their part at the grassroots level. Full remarks are online. And the Special Envoy for Yemen, Martin Griffiths, is traveling to Muscat. After that, he will likely visit Sana'a and Riyadh to continue his consultations on the issue. Mr. Griffiths spoke to reporters in Geneva on Saturday and said he'd had 3 days of fruitful consultations with the Yemeni government delegation. He added that although he did not manage to meet with the Ansarullah delegation, he would go to Muscat and hopefully Sana'a to meet with the Ansarullah leadership. His press remarks are online. And turning to Syria, we remain concerned about the situation of 3 million civilians in Idlib, where an intensification of fighting has resulted in deaths, injury, and displacement, as well as the destruction of civilian infrastructure. The recent escalation of air and ground-based attacks in southern rural Idlib and northern rural Hama province have reportedly resulted in dozens of casualties. From the 1st to the 9th of September, more than 30,000 people were displaced in areas where airstrikes were reported, with the majority of the displaced moving into northern Idlib and to communities close to the Syrian-Turkish border. About half of the displaced people were reportedly staying in camps, 30% hosted by local families, and 15% were self-settled camps or camp-like structures and other accommodations. The United Nations and its partners continue regular humanitarian deliveries to Idlib from the border with Turkey, despite the difficult operational environment. In addition, we are pre-positioning assistance inside Idlib as well as surrounding areas. The UN reminds all parties to take all necessary measures to safeguard civilian lives and to protect civilian infrastructure as required by international humanitarian and human rights law. And turning to Madagascar, the Secretary General Special Advisor, Abdoulaye Bathily, will travel to the capital of Madagascar from the 18th to the 25th of September to continue his facilitation efforts. He will also engage with stakeholders on the ground and take stock of the electoral and political processes before the November 7th presidential poll. You will have seen that over the weekend, the Secretary General welcomed the designation on Friday of Arivo Rakotavao, Speaker of the Malagasy Senate, as acting President of Madagascar, and reiterated the commitment of the United Nations to continue to support the electoral process, leading to a peaceful, credible, and inclusive poll. The statement is online, as well as a statement on the Horn of Africa, which we issued over the weekend. And over the weekend, the Secretary General Special Representative for Iraq, Jan Kubish, condemned the recent violence and riots in Basra, as well as attacks on government, political parties, and media officers and others. He said these acts of violence have nothing to do with the people's rightful demand for services and jobs and their protest against corruption. Mr. Kubish said he fully supports the legitimate demands of the protesters pursued in peaceful ways, and also urged the authorities to ensure law and order and to take firm action against the instigators of violence. In a meeting yesterday, the special representative met with women leaders, former members of parliament, and others to press for the robust participation of women in negotiations for government formation and for holding key ministerial posts. Over the weekend, the Emergency Relief Coordinator, Mark Lowcock, and the High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, wrapped up a 3-day visit to Pakistan, where they highlighted the progress made by the government in responding to people's need in the federally administered tribal areas, including nearly 5 million people returned to their areas of origin. During their visit, they met with the Prime Minister, Imran Khan, and other government officials, donors, leaders, and staff of the UN agencies and NGOs, as well as formerly displaced people. The Emergency Relief Coordinator said that while Pakistan remains highly prone to natural disaster and exposures to climate-related events, the country has made laudable progress in preparedness. In Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, the 2 UN officials saw firsthand the innovative use of cash in response to displaced and returns of people. And the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, spoke to the Human Rights Council in Geneva today in her first speech to that body as High Commissioner, and she discussed her vision for her office and her specific human rights concern. Over the weekend, she also issued a statement saying she's extremely concerned that the Egyptian court's confirmation of 75 death sentences on Saturday did not result from a fair trial, and that the sentences, if carried out, could therefore amount to a gross and irreversible miscarriage of justice. The High Commissioner said she hoped that the Egyptian Court of Appeals would review this verdict and ensure that international standards of justice are respected. And our colleagues at the World Health Organization report that under the leadership of the Democratic Republic of the Congo's Ministry of Health, they and their partners are scaling up the response to the Ebola outbreak in Butembo, a city about 1 million people in North Kivu province, where a patient died last week. WHO says the case was detected quickly and the response is already in place and expanding. More than 60 WHO experts are currently in Butembo setting up a key operation. An emergency operations center is also being built in the city and expected to be operational early this week. A mobile lab is now operational and has become to accept samples and conduct diagnostic tests for the Ebola virus. More information online. Turning to the oceans, over the weekend, a 24-year-old Dutch inventor and UN Environment Champion of the Earth, Boyan Slat, launched an ocean cleanup system expected to tackle 1.8 trillion pieces of plastic marine debris. The system, which was deployed in San Francisco, consists of a 600-meter-long floater that sits at the surface of the water and a tapered 3-meter-deep skirt attached below, which catches plastic debris. For now, the system will undergo some trials before traveling 1,000 nautical miles to what is known as the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. More information on UNEP's site. And we've been updating you the last few days on the declaration of shared commitments for UN peacekeeping, part of the Secretary General's effort to renew political support for UN peacekeeping operations. 42 countries, including major troops and police contributors to UN peacekeeping and UN Security Council members, have now endorsed the declaration. We thank Estonia, Jordan, Bangladesh, Guinea, Slovenia, Finland, Monaco, Germany, Indonesia, Netherlands, Belgium, Portugal, Philippines, Ireland, Slovakia, Latvia, Malta, Hungary, Cape Verde, Comoros, Nigeria, the Republic of Korea, Georgia, Albania, Tunisia, Rwanda, Nepal, South Sudan, Zambia, and Morocco for endorsing our update last week and for their strong commitment to peacekeeping. The Secretary General calls on all member states to join in endorsing the declaration before September 14th, which is at the end of this week, ahead of the high-level summit, a high-level event on action of peacekeeping, which will take place on the 25th of September on the sidelines of the General Assembly. A list of those endorsing countries is being published daily. And lastly, we say thank you. Again, we say a lot of thank yous today to our friends in Zambia who have paid their regular budget dues in full, bringing us up to 1:30. Close enough. All right, I'm done. You ask.
I'll yield to another question.
Okay, Stefano.
Thank you, Stephane. This is about actually the first speech of Bachelet in Geneva. In that speech, she also points finger to Italy and I think also Austria about the policy on the migrants. And she mentioned that the UN will send an inspection the way the migrants have been treated lately in Italy, and she mentioned also the fact that the ship that was the boat that was stopped and not, the human rights had not been respected when the people rescued on the sea were not allowed to disembark. Now there has been a reaction by the Salvini, the Interior Minister of Italy, and it's been a very harsh one. He's been started talking about money. Italy gives a lot of money to the UN, and the UN doesn't use this money well. It's been really, really harsh. I don't know if you read it. So I would like to know, you already read it, so you don't want me to tell all the things that Salvini said. What is the reaction?
I'm delighted to hear the question, Stefano.
The reaction to Salvini's reaction to Bachelet's speech.
Ms. Bachelet gave her first speech today. I think she gave a very factual rundown of areas that were of concern to her. That is her job. That is her responsibility as High Commissioner for Human Rights. Different countries are going to react in different ways. We're not going to comment on that. But what is important, I think, is for every member state to work closely with the High Commissioner for Human Rights and with the mechanism, the UN's human rights mechanism as a whole.
Just a quick follow-up. Because there has been this specific reaction saying we give a lot of money and the UN has been wasting this money, wasting a lot of money. Now, what is it? Just forget the migrants and Bachelet. Just the reaction on that specific, an Italian importer, because he's also deputy premier of the Italy government, the UN is wasting money. What is the reaction?
We appreciate all of the monies that are entrusted to us by all member states, assess contributions and others, and we continue to encourage member states to work cooperatively with us. Richard.
Stephane, the U.S. National Security Advisor has threatened sanctions on the International Court, membership, travel ban, asset freezes. Maybe that's a little too much. Anyway, in a speech a little while ago, what's the UN reaction to the U.S. National Security Advisor going after this bedrock organization?
Well, as I often say, it's a bit asymmetrical warfare because you're able to watch the speech while I'm standing up here on the podium. So we'll have to listen to the speech. I think what is important for the Secretary General's standpoint is his continued support for the ICC and for the critical role it plays in accountability worldwide.
Thanks, Steph. You mentioned Michelle Bachelet's press release over the weekend about the 75 confirmed death sentences over the weekend. Does Antonio Guterres have a reaction to that? And is there any update on the status of the photojournalist Shaukan who reported on the Rabaa massacre?
I think a couple of things. First, the Secretary General's standpoint against the death penalty is well known. It has unchanged. The Secretary General subscribes to the position of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and also hopes that clemency will be shown by the authorities. As for the photojournalist for Shaukat, I think the Secretary General has been following this case very closely. We understand that he is now free, that he was sentenced to 5 years and he'd already served 5 years, so he's now been free. This is very much good news and a positive development. Al Jazeera 2.
Yes, I'd like to ask you a question again about the Bolton speech. I know you haven't heard it and it's ongoing right now, and I'm sorry for blurting out a bit of it a moment ago as I was trying to check on it. But there's been an announcement that he's been talking about, which is the US is closing the PLO office in Washington, D.C. Does the Secretary General think this is a positive development in terms of Middle East peace?
Again, I would beg your indulgence and let us listen and read the speech before reacting.
Can I ask another question on something different?
You may?
Idlib.
Yeah.
Lots of warnings of a humanitarian catastrophe were made on Friday, and yet the bombardment is growing there in Idlib. Does the Secretary General, in fearing there could be this humanitarian catastrophe that Mr. Ging and Mr. de Mistura talked about, want to warn the parties of possible breaches of international law? Because one assumes that if you attack an area where there are so many civilians that you are in danger of war crimes.
We have been repeatedly warning the parties against breaches of international humanitarian law, international human rights law, whether it's the Secretary General, his envoys, his representatives. We have seen over the term of the conflict in Syria repeated attacks against civilians, against civilian infrastructure. The people continue to suffer. The Secretary General, in his own statement last week, underscored the catastrophic consequences of an all-out military attack. His special envoy, Mr. de Mistura, has been working the phones. I think he is today doing a political meeting with the Astana guarantors. The message from him and from the Secretary General, whether privately or publicly, is to put a halt and to avoid military action and to coalesce around a political solution. Mr. Klein.
Does the Secretary General have any comment on the reported multiple stabbings in Paris over the last 24 hours, reportedly by an Afghan national? And does he have any comment on the Swedish elections yesterday, in which the party that came in third was avowedly anti-immigrant?
No, from what I gather, the elections in Sweden took place. There are discussions going on to form a government. Secretary General is not going to comment particularly on that at this point. We've seen the reports in Paris. Obviously, we condemn the attack regardless of the motivation. We wish those injured a speedy recovery, but we have to wait, I think. The French are in the lead in the investigation. We have to wait and see what happens.
But would you see any relationship between such crimes, and in fact Sweden itself has experienced in the last month multiple arson attacks in migrant communities, and the rise in Europe of this populist
I'm not going
anti-immigration
to comment
movement?
on this on the attack in Paris, which, as I said, the investigation is ongoing. What we have seen, and any violence is to be condemned, regardless of who commits it and against whom. But we have seen repeatedly in Europe, I think currently and in not too recent past, a scapegoating of migrant communities. And I think the Secretary General has expressed his concern on that front. Thank you, and I will leave you with Mr. Varma.